Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we are both looking very festive, aren't we?
I think so. Trying to look festive. I'm trying to outshine the Syracuse Temple.
Oh, okay. Well, that's going to take some doing, even though it's not opened or dedicated. It's still really, really
Still
bright.
bright, yeah.
And I tried to choose a bright, sparkly holiday shirt, but now that I'm looking at it on camera, I feel like it looks more like a Star Trek uniform, which I'm okay either way. Honestly, I really
That's
am
true.
okay.
What's the difference? Christmas in your house consisted of Star Trek,
It
so
does. It does. One of my favorite Christmas movies is The Wreath of Khan.
the wreath of God. Oh,
I
geez.
know. Now
They
I'm
say
telling the
dad
dad.
jokes. These are
I,
mom jokes.
I feel like right here, like probably 30, 40 people just tuned out of the episode right
Yeah.
there just for that. I apologize. Anyway, it is getting extremely close to Christmas. And that's why we're getting more and more festive with our backgrounds and what we're wearing. And this episode has everything to do with Christmas, doesn't it, Landon?
It absolutely does. It's the beginnings of Christmas.
The origin story of Christmas is what we're going to discuss. So we have some awesome slides. I have to say, I had a lot of fun putting these together, and I think it's going to be really informative. So our first slide will kind of tell us what we're talking about. There it is. Is the Christmas story just a story? What do you think I mean by that, Landon, when I put that title up there?
Well, did it happen? Or at least did it happen the way it is said that it happened?
Exactly, because this is the origin story. This is the reason for the season and everything. And, it's documented, of course, in the scriptures, but did it happen exactly like you said? Did it happen the way it happened? We're going to dive in and figure that out.
Yeah, that may not be a star. It may be an exploding engine on an airplane that President Nelson was on in the sky in the background there.
It could be, or it could be a drone over
A
New
drone.
Jersey. I was just
Yeah.
reading about that today, and I'm like, okay, the world is kind of going to hell. Maybe we need Christmas more than ever. Maybe it's Santa's sleigh over New Jersey. Has anybody put forward that hypothesis?
That could be. That could be.
That could be.
So,
That's exactly right.
well, we're definitely going to find out what was and, what did and didn't happen, or at least what, has no explanation for. So.
Exactly. Yep. We're going to go through a lot of the narrative and the origin. So let's go to our next slide. Like I said, this is pretty slide heavy, but there's a lot of information. So I wanted to start out just with those of us that were raised LDS, like you and I were. Christmas is a big deal. I actually have really happy memories of singing primary songs as a Christmas kid, getting up and doing, a Christmas program. And then when I was an adult as a primary pianist, playing those songs for the kids and having them dress up. I do. I have warm, fuzzy memories of that kind of Christmas in the LDS church. Do you have any memories like that?
Oh, yeah, definitely singing the songs. I still enjoy songs about Christmas. It doesn't matter to me that, I don't necessarily believe the
Mhm.
origin stories, but I still enjoy the music.
Yep. Yeah, music is a huge part of Christmas. That's true. So I thought we'd start by going through the LDS Christmas narrative. And I got this right. If you go to the next slide, I got this right off of the church's website. And this is more of a, boy, everything's about stories for kids, isn't it, this week?
Yeah.
As we just dove into that plural marriage story. This is the nativity story written, I think, for youth, for kids, but it is right off of the church's website. So I thought I would read this because this kind of describes, simplistically, how the LDS church has put forward the nativity narrative all this year. So I'll start out and then we can trade off. It says, a long time ago, a woman named Mary and a man named Joseph were going to be married. Mary and Joseph were good people who did what God wanted them to do. One day, an angel came to Mary and told her that she was going to have a baby. The angel said she should name the baby Jesus. The baby would be the Son of God, the Savior.
Problematic if you're LDS.
Exactly.
You want me to read that?
Yeah, we'll just take turns reading.
Okay.
This is right off of the church's website.
Mary and Joseph had to travel to a town called Bethlehem to pay taxes. The town was very crowded, so Mary and Joseph spent the night in a place where animals were kept. That night, baby Jesus was born. A new star appeared in the sky.
Oh, see, this hits all the points. That's exactly right. The shepherds were taking care of sheep in nearby fields. Angels came and told the shepherds that the Savior had been born. The shepherds went to find and worship baby Jesus?
Far away, wise men saw the new star. They knew it was a sign that the Savior had been born. They followed the star until they found Jesus. They gave him presents and worshiped him.
Yep, right there. That's part of the story. After the wise men left, an angel visited Joseph. The angel said a bad king wanted to hurt Jesus. The angel said their family should move to Egypt to be safe.
Joseph, Mary, and Jesus lived in Egypt until it was safe to return to Israel. Jesus grew up in a town called Nazareth. He learned to be helpful, kind, and obedient. He learned everything that he needed to learn to be our Savior. He always followed God's plan for him.
Yep. And I love this picture of Jesus. Look at that. Every time I try to find a new one, it's just, this is like sultry. I mean, look at that. Look. Good heavens.
He gets better looking as he ages. He's like a fine wine.
Yeah,
So.
he is. I mean, those piercing eyes. I mean, I would make a joke about Jesus and an OnlyFans page, but I'm not going to go there. So, but yeah, so many very different. I guess I'm trying to say is the pictures that we grew up with, right? That were more of the traditional. So, all right. So, what we're actually talking about on this episode is, did it happen? The nativity, the Christmas story, the birth narrative. In a nutshell, there's no internal or external corroboration for the stories. There's good motivation for their fabrication, and there are significant historical errors in both accounts in the scriptures. That's kind of our thesis statement, isn't it, Landon?
Yeah, I think it's more than a thesis statement. It's a statement of fact that there's no internal or external corroboration for the stories. Yep. And obviously, there's a reason to fabricate it if you're trying to start a religion based on a man who was, crucified. Yep. So
that's it. And we're going to kind of walk through all of this, the motivations, the corroborations, and some of the, if you go to the next slide, I've called it, what are the problems? And, maybe problems is the wrong word. Just what are the issues with the story? And again, each one that we go through, there are so many Christian apologetics about each one. We welcome all of you to dive into any of the things that we mention here. We're not going to go into any of the apologetics. We're just going to point out what scholars sort of collectively had said that are some of the issues or problems with this nativity narrative. I found it very interesting. I knew a few of them, some of the superficial, kind of more obvious ones. Some of them I didn't know. And as I was researching, I was like, oh my gosh, But like I said, welcome anybody to dive into the apologetics of it, because there are a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you got to say more than, oh yeah, you've got to really look at these and see, because yeah, you can come up with a solution, you can come up with an answer, but does that answer really hold any water? Just as this might be, it could have been, or whatever. Right. You need to look at what was real and what we can really answer.
Exactly. But as we find in, apologetics for a lot of the LDS materials we go through, if you need it to be true, if you need that narrative, then you're going to find a way to make it real. But this was absolutely fascinating to me. So one of the first things is he has to be a God problem. He has to be, the Son of God. He has to be divine. He has to be a deity. Do you want to read that, Landon?
Yeah, one part of the answer comes from Hellenistic culture. It is no accident all New Testament books were written in Greek. In this tradition, when a man did something extraordinary, there was the assumption that he did this because he was different, either divine or semi-divine. They would make up a story about how he came to be divine. Almost all Greek heroes were said to be born of a human woman and a god, even Alexander the Great, Augustus, and Pythagoras. The father typically was Zeus or Apollo. The god would come and sleep with the woman, pretending to be the husband or as a bolt of lightning or some such. Greek mythology also shows up in the book of Genesis, the gods lusting after the women and coming down and mating with them.
Now, so what do you think about that concept? It's sort of an age-old concept. Somebody that's notable has to have an origin story where there's divinity.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with this. They were living in a Hellenistic society at the time, so it makes sense that their culture, you can't have Jesus be God unless he meets the requirements to be a God, just like in all of the other uh, God stories that are circulating around the area. So if someone else was a god and he had to have a godfather,
A
a
God,
father
a
who was a god
Godfather.
and a mother who was a human, well, Jesus can't be any less than that. Therefore, there's got to be a story made up that shows that Jesus came from a god and a human mother. Otherwise, he could not be divine. You can only be divine if you were the offspring of a god.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And that speaks to motivation for a
Mm-hmm.
fabrication. He has to somehow have a divine origin. Because think about, okay, being a missionary back in that day, and you're trying to talk about your God, and someone else is like, well, no, my God was born, Zeus and Apollo. And you're like, well, my God, we really need a backstory, don't we?
Yeah.
So that kind of speaks to the fabrication. So let's go to the next slide. All right, I can read this one. So Jewish Christians, the first Christians didn't believe in the virgin birth. They believed that Joseph was the biological father of Jesus. Part of their Christology was adoptionism. They thought Jesus was adopted as the unique son of God at some time later in his life. There were disagreements about when. Mark suggests baptism, Paul suggests resurrection. Over time, Gentile Christianity replaced Jewish Christianity. There were Jewish Roman wars. The Jewish Christians were marginalized and oppressed. The Gentile branch became dominant. Eventually, we get the Gospel of John, which pushes the sonship of Jesus back to the very beginning of time. This writer is at the other end of the spectrum from the Jewish Christians, but Matthew and Luke, and they're the ones that are responsible for this origin story, as we'll talk about in a minute, think that the sonship of Jesus began at birth. And they wanted to tell a story that reinforces this point. Matthew and Luke are the sources of the Christmas story, as most of us learned this. And you probably already knew this, Landon. It wasn't super clear to me, but I mean, now it is, having dug in and done some research.
Yeah, it's called Christology, and
Mm-hmm.
basically what it is Jesus becomes more godlike the later in the writings that he shows up. So you've got uh, Paul, who is actually the earliest writings in about 50 A.D., and in Paul's writings, Jesus never. There's no mention of the divine birth anywhere in Paul's writings. The next book that came along is the book of Mark. And when we say Mark, Mark didn't write the book of Mark. Matthew didn't write the book of
Right.
Matthew. So when we talk about this, we're talking about the writer of that
Mm-hmm.
book. But Mark, Jesus does not have a divine birth. Jesus, in fact, it's called the Markan mystery. Nobody knows who Jesus is. Everyone's amazed, going, "Oh, who is this that can do this? Who is this man?" And in Mark, Jesus doesn't become, as it says here, in Paul, Jesus didn't become the Son of God until the resurrection. At that
Mm-hmm.
point, he was adopted as the Son of God. And that's the earliest writings. In Mark, which is the next earliest writing, he doesn't become the Son of God until he's baptized. And when he's baptized, that's when God says, "This is my Son." In Matthew and Mark, or in Matthew and Luke, which are the two that have a birth narrative story go with them, they now take it back and say, no, he was the Son of God since he was born. He was born as the Son of God. And then when you get to John, it's, oh, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was made God. So Jesus was always a God before he was ever born. That's not until like 90 AD or 100 AD that we get that story. So over 50 years, we get a story that goes from he was adopted at the resurrection to he was God before he even came to earth. All, all four of these writers, or all five of these writers, have a different story and a
Mm-hmm.
different perspective of when Jesus became a God, and they all differ. And the birth narrative is just one of the five, or it's in two of the Gospels, so two of
Mm-hmm.
the five make that claim.
Yeah, so interesting. When we'll talk about the two narratives and how different they are. So it's so interesting to put things side by side and really take a look. So let's go to our next slide. Okay, so, and again, we're just listing out, we're calling them problems, but they're issues that scholars have drawn attention to. And of course, there are apologetics to each of these that anybody can go and look up and find out more. So the late addition problem, and you kind of touched on this a little bit. The first problem with the birth of Jesus narrative is that it appears to be a late addition to the Jesus story, like you just mentioned. None of the earliest Christian documents mention anything about the virgin birth or the trip to Bethlehem or any of it. And that's it's interesting to talk about the order of the books, right? Because it's not exactly clear how it kind of pans out as you were describing when they were actually written. But the Nativity is a late addition.
We also have to keep in mind that the writers of Matthew, the writers of Mark, the writers of Luke, even Paul, none of these guys were there when this event happened.
Right.
So how are they finding out about this event?
Yeah.
Word of mouth? Who's telling them? The shepherds? The wise men came and told them the story?
100 years later, I don't
Mary,
know.
Martha's telling it. I mean, Mary's telling. James, the brother of Jesus, is telling. There's problems with that philosophy too. So where did this story come from? Herod didn't seem to know anything about it. We'll talk about some of the problems with Herod as well. But this isn't written anywhere. So where did they get the story from?
Exactly. And that goes back to our thesis statement, no external corroboration of any of that. So that is very interesting. Do you want to read this one, Landon?
So what are our earliest documents? The letters of Paul are the first written Christian documents. This is slightly confusing because in the Bible, Paul's letters are placed after the Gospels. But the New Testament is not arranged in order of publication date, and actually Paul's letters, or at least the 7 authentic ones, were written before any of the Gospels, somewhere around 50 to 60 AD. There are no references in Paul's letters to the virgin birth or the divine conception or being born in Bethlehem.
Yeah, I think we're making the point pretty well.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist. That's right. But again, did I know that? I kind of knew that, or I knew it and I forgot it, but I hadn't really thought it through like that. So again, I'll read this. This is kind of what we touched on. Our earliest gospel is Mark, probably written around 70 AD. And Mark had absolutely no reference to the birth of Jesus or any of the miracles that supposedly accompanies it. In Mark's gospel, the story starts when Jesus is already an adult. It is not until the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written sometimes between 70 and 90, that the stories of the birth of Christ even appear. This late date alone should raise a lot of questions and presents the possibility that the story of Christ was being more and more mythologized as time went on. John, although it was the last gospel to be written, also says nothing about the birth of Christ. It is hypothesized that although John is the latest gospel, it comes from a completely separate tradition than the synoptic gospels. And in that tradition, there apparently were no miraculous stories about the birth of Jesus Christ either, right? So nowhere, like you said, where is this coming from?
Yeah. And how does Matthew and Luke know about it and Mark doesn't? Mark's never heard these stories.
Right.
Or Mark just forgets to mention that he was born of a God. I mean, that would be the most important element to put in your story. Is God came down and made a virgin pregnant, and that was Jesus. But Mark doesn't even touch on it. Doesn't seem to know anything about it. How is that possible that Mark wouldn't have known about it? And if Mark was actually written by Mark, it would be someone that was closer than whoever wrote Matthew and Luke, because that was written much later, and Mark was actually a person, at least. I mean, Matthew and Luke were people, but we know it wasn't written by the apostles. It was written by someone using their name. So
it kind of reminds me of the first vision as I was researching it, that there's different accounts, differing accounts, and yet the apologetics in Christianity seem to be, well, they all just kind of add to each other and make it stronger, kind of like they say about the first vision, where the rest of us are kind of scratching our head going, I don't know, they're differing or not mentioned, or how does that make it stronger?
Yeah, and of course, in the first vision, it was over, just 6 or so years that the story got changed and developed. Yep. Here, you've got people making the stories up 20, 30 years after the other stories, and 50 years after, or 50 years after the resurrection, supposed resurrection, and almost 70 to 100 years after this birth event happened, are you finally getting a story about this happening?
Yeah, and much like the first vision, where they make it what it has to be. The
Yeah.
final version, the amalgam, has to be the Father and the Son, right? Even though they're not mentioned in some of the stories. And I feel like the Christmas story also has to have certain elements. They're absolutely necessary to match the narrative of the Son of God and Christ in his ministry. And so, again, a great motivation for fabrication to make it what they need it to be.
Well, the other thing we have to look at is what's happening in the church at the same time, because in a Jewish tradition, God doesn't in a Jewish tradition, God doesn't have to give birth to, doesn't come down and have sex with women and have demigods. There's only one God in Jewish tradition. There can't be room for a human God. But now in these years, the church is going out to the Gentiles, to a world, a Hellenistic world, in which case their gods are fathered by other gods, are fathered by gods. And so now, in order to convince them, they have to make this story up to make it palatable to these people that he was actually who he says he was. But the Jewish tradition doesn't need that story.
Yeah, that's what I mean. If you're a missionary, you tailor it kind of to what the people are used to hearing, like missionaries now that say the good news, right? That's a very Christian phrase that I probably would have gotten in trouble for using when I was a kid. But now you hear that in missionary letters all the time. We share the good news, because that's how people are used to hearing and understanding the gospel, I think.
Yep. So if you're going to make a god in the Roman, the world of Greek and Romans, you have to have a story that shows that they're divine, of divine origin, born of the gods.
That's it. All right, let's move forward. Ooh, here we go. It all comes from Matthew and Luke. Problem. This is one that's very interesting. Go ahead, Landon.
Everything we know about Jesus' birth comes from just 4 chapters in the Bible, Matthew 1-2 and Luke 1-2. These are the only places in the entire Bible that mention Jesus' birth, and Luke 2 contains the only stories about Jesus' childhood. The rest of the New Testament shows no awareness of these stories at all.
Yep. I don't know if I actually realized that. Isn't that terrible to say? I'm not sure if I really did until I started digging in and studying.
Yeah, I always knew because I always read these stories at Christmas, and I always had to find them in the Bible. But yeah, when you start thinking, why would only 2 of the 4 gospel writers and only 2 of we've got John the Revelator, we've got James, the brother of Jesus, who doesn't write about it. We've got all the different people writing in the Bible, and yet only 2 of them mention this fact that he was born from a God.
Yeah. I mean, I think I knew the Christmas stories were there, but I thought there might have been mentioned somewhere. I don't know what I was thinking. And then to understand how different the 2 accounts are that we're going to get into. That's what's really mind blowing.
Because we've all lumped the 2 together, but they were written separately. So we have to take each one separately and say, this is what this guy said happened, and this is what this guy said happened. And there's a lot missing from this guy's and a lot missing from this guy's that the other guy seemed to know. So how did he only know this? He only knew this. This guy didn't know anything about it, and this guy never mentions it at all,
Exactly. And each story supports the narrative of that particular author or, community, whoever
the community
was
that he represents.
I mean, it reminds me of our episode with Anthony Miller, where he's explaining, look, there's 2 creation stories. There's this, which supports that narrative. There's that. There's a lot of examples of that where it's like dueling Bibles, right? No.
Yeah.
That's it. So, and this is kind of interesting. This kind of gives a little behind the scenes. Scholars are more likely to believe a story about Jesus is authentic if the same story is told in multiple independent sources. This is called multiple attestation. And doesn't that make sense? That's one reason why scholars think that Jesus was actually baptized by John and executed by crucifixion. Both events appear in all 4 gospels. Not only that, but both of these events are supported by non-biblical sources. Several Roman and Jewish contemporaries of the New Testament writers document John baptizing people and Jesus' execution by Pontius Pilate. So that goes back to the no corroboration in any non-biblical source. If it's mentioned other places, it's documented, because boy, those Romans wrote down everything, right? They documented everything. Then there's more of a likelihood that it happened in some way. There's some truth to it.
Yeah, we hear pushback whenever we say that Jesus was a follower of John and that that's where he came from. And everyone says, no, Jesus was not a
Yeah.
follower of
No.
John. John was less than Jesus.
Mm-mm.
The reason biblical scholars believe that Jesus was a follower of John and kind of took over when John died was exactly this reason. All four of the Gospels mention that he was baptized by John the Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
which indicates he was a follower of John the Baptist. He was following that faith tradition. That wasn't a Jewish tradition to baptize people.
Mm-mm.
John was teaching this, and Jesus seemed to come from that philosophical school, I guess you could say, and that the people that ended up following Jesus also came from that school. So that makes it, very likely that the real Jesus would have been a follower of John and been associated with John's movement. It's interesting to note that the only two events that are corroborated in all four Gospels are non-miraculous.
Exactly.
Uh,
Baptism and
Baptism
execution.
and
Yep.
execution. The
Very earthly
resurrection,
practices.
yeah, the resurrection is left out of Mark. You can find a resurrection story in Mark now, but the original did not have it. We know it was added years and years later because we have texts from the early 200 AD,
Mm-hmm.
and we have copies of John from there. And in multiple ones, there's no resurrection story, and then later it starts showing up in the in the manuscripts that are much newer than that. You start getting a resurrection story. So really the only things that are attested to is that he was baptized and he was killed.
Yeah. And I've always said that Salome is the mother of Christianity. Had she not demanded John's head, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
was killed, John was the head of that religious movement. He was the one.
Yeah, may very well been the one who took off, but Jesus kind of filled the
Yeah.
vacuum when
He was the
John was
understudy.
beheaded. Yes, and kind of moved into that role. Or we say that's what a lot of biblical scholars think happened, because it explains a lot. That more than just this guy shows up out of nowhere and starts doing miracles, because the stories don't agree about him showing up and doing all of these miracles.
Yep. And Jesus was following the practices of John. I mean, it talks about the practices of John, right? And what he was doing. And Jesus was doing the same thing. So
Yeah,
anyway, that could be a whole nother episode.
When I say that that it wasn't attested that he did these miracles, all the gospel writers will write about miracles he did. The problem is, in the synoptic gospels, when you line them up, what we see is Jesus says the same things over and over in the three different synoptic gospels, but it's almost word for word. So they're copying from the same source.
Yes.
They change a few, like Jesus instead of he or whatever. They change a few of the pronouns or whatever, but there's too many words in a row that it's not just happenstance that they're writing the same words in a row. They're copying from some source. The problem is all the stories around those comments that he's saying are different. They're telling a different story about the same comment. So that tells us that it probably came from a source that they call Q, and that source, we don't have the source, was a quote. They had the quotes of Jesus or sayings of Jesus, but they had stories that they knew, and they were attaching stories and building them around these sayings that they have. And no one knew anything about sayings gospels until they were found. I think it was in the Nag Hammadi library, the gospel of which gospel was
Thomas?
it? Gospel of Thomas they found, and it was a sayings
Yeah.
the whole
I
thing
love
was
that
nothing
Gospel of Thomas.
but
I have
Jesus
it right
saying
here.
things. Yep.
Some of those are really good. Yeah. I'm sorry. We get really passionate about dissecting the Bible. That's one of kind of our little side hobbies because it's so interesting. I mean, it all really began there. So let's forge ahead and focus on the nativity story. But this is all very relevant because it all speaks to motivation and purpose of creating these stories. So there is no non-biblical evidence to support the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke. This, of course, is not the end-all be-all piece of evidence, but its presence or absence is certainly telling. So that alone is something you could probably stay up all night thinking about. But there's more.
but that is critical because, we read about a star,
Mhm.
and a star of that import that you could follow, that was that bright and that magnificent, would have been recorded by
Yeah.
multiple different cultures.
And we have a whole section on the
Yeah,
star.
and we've got
Exactly.
that.
Yep.
So there should be non-biblical
Yes.
evidence
Especially
supporting
about the
this
star.
narrative.
Yep.
Yeah.
Especially about that. So the Matthew and Luke are different in their accounts. Problem. And this is where I think I didn't realize there were so many differences between, and I'm trying to think what my parents had me read when we did the little manger scene. It was just me and my sister. We had a Cocker Spaniel that we put in a laundry basket, and that was baby Jesus. We played the piano, some hymns, and my dad had put together this wonderful Christmas program. I'm going to have to find it looking back because I think he took scriptures from each one to fill it out and make this amalgam, this narrative. Much again, I'll compare it to the first vision where you take bits and pieces till you come up with the story everyone's familiar with. Do you want to read this, Landon?
Yeah, there are many differences between the accounts in Matthew and Luke. Some things cannot be reconciled. For example, if Luke is right that the family returned to Nazareth 32 days after the birth, how can Matthew be right that the family fled to Egypt? And so on. The Christmas stories in Matthew and Luke differ in a number of ways, including.
That's right. And I just listed a few here. Each one again can be, a deep dive down a rabbit hole. So who finds Jesus? In Matthew, the Magi find Jesus, while in Luke, the shepherds find Jesus. I mean, that clearly completely different. Also,
What?
what happens after Jesus's birth? We just talked about this. In Matthew, Jesus' family flees to Egypt, while in Luke, Jesus goes to Nazareth. And in other events, Matthew includes the massacre of the infants, Joseph's dreams, and the star. I didn't realize those were only in Matthew, but they are. In Luke, he includes the census, John the Baptist's birth, and the presentation at the temple. I guess we need to kind of make a side-by-side list, huh?
Yeah, it's odd that the star wouldn't be told by all of these people,
Right.
something that notable. Uh, the census, okay, if you want to, but the massacre of the infants,
That's a huge part of the story.
you would have in this culture, you would have an entire 2-year period where there were no men, babies, or
Yeah.
there's an age group where there's no men because they were all massacred. This would certainly be something that would have been mentioned by all of these groups if that were the case.
Yeah. And I think we have a slide kind of going into more detail on that too. Let's look at a few other just general differences. Oh, you want to read this one, Landon?
Yeah, circumcision. Luke mentions Jesus' circumcision while Matthew does not. Atmosphere. In Luke, Bethlehem is filled with singing, while in Matthew, Bethlehem is filled with weeping.
Hmm.
Treasures. In Luke, Mary treasures spiritual things, while in Matthew, the wise men offer earthly treasures.
So, just very different accounts. I challenge everyone to just open your scriptures and go read the two accounts. And I'm sure you'll pick up on some different things too, but they are very different. All right, the hometown problem. This is a good one. You want to read this, Landon?
The two accounts disagree with each other on major details. In Matthew's version, Jesus is from Bethlehem, and his family only ends up in Nazareth because they're fleeing persecution from King Herod. In Luke's account, Jesus' family is from Nazareth and only goes to Bethlehem because of a Roman census. So they knew that the Messiah had to come from Bethlehem. So both authors are trying to get Jesus put into Bethlehem.
Right.
And so one of them says, oh, that's where they lived and that's where he was born at. And this is how he ended up in Nazareth. Whereas the other one says, oh, he was from Nazareth and went to Bethlehem just to pay taxes. It was just a temporary thing. Two completely different stories, as if they're trying to, this is apologetics. They're trying to establish how did this Savior from Nazareth meet the biblical prophecy of being born in Bethlehem?
Right. And
People
that's
were probably
important.
asking, probably all the anti-Christians were asking the question.
Yeah, what about Bethlehem? Yeah, and that's important to say. He was prophesied the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, so they have to get him there somehow. They have to create a reason that he was there, and they both did it in different
ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was really interesting. I'm telling you, doing research on this kind of blew my mind. It really did. Both gospel writers claim that Jesus is actually from Bethlehem because both faced a significant problem. The Hebrew Bible prophesies that the Jewish Messiah will come from there, the hometown of the greatest King David. So where King David was is where the Messiah was coming from. Jesus, however, is referred to over and over throughout the New Testament as being from Nazareth. In fact, outside of these 4 chapters, the word Bethlehem appears in only one other verse in the New Testament. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, and this one's kind of, I guess, this just came to me. I need to do a little research on it, but you know, the different tribes had different areas that they came from, and you didn't just move around. It wasn't like the United States where you say, "Hey, I got a job in Nazareth, I'm heading out." Your family lands and everything, your tribe, the tribe that you came from was in that area. So does it really make sense that Jesus was born in Nazareth, which is way up north and out a long way from Jerusalem, or that he was from, you know, the Bethlehem, which was just walking distance from Jerusalem and a major metropolitan area? That he would just move for that reason. There's, to me, that raises some questions. I don't know. Maybe some other people know more about that, but it seems odd that you would leave your tribal lands.
Tribal area. Yeah. Yep. This raises a lot of questions. It really does. Scholars see this as a plausible reason why a gospel writer or the communities that produced them would fabricate a whole birth story, as we mentioned before. They needed to explain to a skeptical audience, like you just said, right? Apologetics, the fair Mormon of early Christianity, right? They needed to explain to a skeptical audience familiar with the prophecy that Jesus was actually from Bethlehem.
Yeah, the North Koreans do this same thing. They have to make the son, you know, Kim Jong-un had to be born on a sacred mountain in North Korea, and he was born, the gods brought him down, he was born of gods and everything. They do that same myth story. Yet we know exactly where he was born and when he was born, but the North Koreans don't, because they spin this tale to make him sound divine. And so this is not unheard of. This practice goes on all the time, even in our day and age, that you've got to make the person divine, so you spin a story that makes them sound divine.
Yeah, I know. It also even makes me think of origin stories of the founding fathers. Not that they're a divinity, but their origin stories make them, you know, give them these attributes that are, you know, amazing. I will not tell a lie. I cannot, you know, so it's interesting. Ooh, the genealogy problem. You want to read this one, Landon?
They're completely different genealogies offered by Matthew 1 and Luke 3. Matthew says Jesus is a descendant of David through his son Solomon, while Luke traces Jesus to David through a different son, Nathan. The genealogies were likely added for theological and literary effect. So, yeah, I think most of us are probably familiar with this. If you've ever read the 2 genealogies, they have different names in them. And sometimes they go back to the same person, and then that person has a different father or a son. They don't follow the narrative. They don't follow anything that you can trace back. And the church's answer is one is the mother's and one is the father's, but that doesn't follow. That doesn't make any sense, because they trace back to the same people, and that's wrong as well.
Right. And what are they trying to achieve? Why is it so important?
Because Jesus had to be a direct descendant of David. So they're trying to link Jesus to David. And so they're putting all these people, they're trying to find a path to get him back, because he's not a royal member of the royal family. He's a carpenter in Nazareth, but somehow we have to make him the son of David. So the fact that we have 2 different genealogies for the same person brings you, I'm not saying that there's not 2 genealogies from a mother and a father, but the way they're listed, that's not how they're listed. As if, and why would you trace Joseph's ancestry anyway if Joseph wasn't the father? if he was actually the son of God, then only Mary's genealogy is the only way to tie him to David. Joseph's genealogy would be irrelevant. So, yeah, problem.
Yeah, things we don't think about, right? Very interesting. All right, what else do we have? Ooh, the census problem. We kind of alluded to this before. This is very interesting. So Luke tells us that Jesus was born during a Roman census. And remember, Matthew doesn't mention this at all. This is all in Luke. Born during a Roman census that required everyone to return to their ancestral hometown. But there's no evidence of such a census taking place during this period. The Romans were excellent record keepers. Yes, they were, particularly when it came to taxation. So this part of the story is very likely false. And then I think we have one more slide on the census. If you can go to the next one. Yeah. Not to mention the idea that Rome would periodically shut down their empire's economy by forcing everyone to travel to their ancestral homes is, in a word, preposterous. Roman law assessed property in a person's place of residence, not their ancestral hometown. The Roman governor of Syria, Quirinius, did conduct a census in 6 CE, but it was only of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, not the entire Roman world, as Luke claims, and definitely not Galilee, which is where Jesus's family lived.
Yeah, several problems. Luke tells us about the census for taxation. Interesting because Matthew was the tax collector, if we remember by tradition. Why wouldn't Matthew be the one who's knowledgeable about a census and a tax collection rather than Luke? Of course, we know Matthew wasn't really written by Matthew, but yeah, huge problems. This would be the equivalent of saying everyone in the U.S. It's April 15th. We need to collect your taxes. Everyone has to go back to where they were born to pay your taxes. What would that do? And this is a time with no cars, but even today, if everyone had to get on an airplane and fly back to their hometown or drive back to their hometown to pay their taxes, the entire economy would be completely disrupted, and you'd spend more money getting back to pay your taxes than you paid in taxes in the first place. So
yes,
that's a problem. The other problem that we have with the taxes is that the governor of Syria didn't even conduct a census till 6 CE, which is far too late for Jesus's birth, if he was really 33 at the time of his death. And the other problem is that Herod, who the Wisemen show up to, who's supposedly the king when he was born, when Herod was the king, it was not a Roman province, it was a client kingdom. And in a client kingdom, the king collected the taxes, not the Romans. The Romans didn't care how the king got the taxes. They just said, King Herod, you pay us so much in gold every year as tribute to us, and we'll leave you alone. And then he was to gather it up. So a Roman a Roman statement for taxes would not have applied to anyone living under King Herod at the time.
Right. And there's even a problem with Herod and the governor of Syria right there that we'll talk about. So yeah. And again, it wasn't mentioned anywhere. This kind of mobilization of people going to their hometowns, it would have been recorded. There would have been things
everywhere,
said, I believe, everywhere. Yeah, it would have been known as a practice. So, but it doesn't exist anywhere except for in these accounts. Ooh, here we go. King Herod's decree problem. Do you want to read this, Landon?
Matthew's account has similar issues. He writes that King Herod ordered all children under 2 years old in and around Bethlehem to be slaughtered. Yet there exists no record of this massacre in any chronicle or history of the time. Not Jewish, not Christian, not Roman. This would have been a noteworthy atrocity, especially since we know quite a bit about Herod the Great from other historical sources. This word of a king killing every child 2 years and under, every male child 2 years and under, would have been reported in the to the Romans about how this man was behaving. It would have been known. This man would have been hated from the people would have risen up and gotten rid of him. Think how many people it's your grandkid, that's your kid that he killed. You're going to be fighting this man all the way for that horrible atrocity he did. And yet there's no mention. This is the equivalent of not mentioning the Holocaust nowadays, that it would never be mentioned with World War II. It's just inconceivable that this did not get reported somewhere to somebody. And you think about this, why would a king do this? Because you just killed your army for 2 years. If you need an army, there's this 2-year period where you killed everyone that's a potential soldier in your army was just massacred by you. You're going to have a hard time 18 years from now putting an army together when a large number of your men aren't available.
And wouldn't he have gotten in some kind of trouble from someone beyond him?
Well, the Romans,
who he reported to, who said, "What, we need these men. We may have to." I mean, don't you think that there would have been some pushback?
The
Romans would have seen as kind of a rogue act.
Yeah, the Romans certainly would have recorded this, because the Romans would take client kings and say, "You need to provide us conscript soldiers to serve." They were called auxiliaries. You need to provide auxiliaries to support us in the area. And if they just killed your potential source for soldiers in the future, this would be recorded. Likewise, because there would be uprisings, and that's exactly what happened in Jerusalem. There were uprisings. They would say, oh, this would be reported to the Romans, because now a potential gap in their army just became apparent. And if they're going to have an uprising against you, you're going to report, hey, he just killed a big portion of his potential military. That's something you're going to record and want to know that he doesn't have soldiers available in that age group.
Right. And Herod the Great was known for other atrocities. Every single one was recorded. And that's what they're saying is, why would you not record? This would be the worst of them.
Yeah.
So, but again, no record anywhere outside of this story in Matthew. As they say, despite having extensive historical records about Herod the Great's reign, including detailed accounts from the Jewish historian Josephus, there is no corroborating evidence in any contemporary Jewish, Christian, or Roman sources for the mass slaughter of children described in Matthew 2.
Yeah, big problem.
Yep. Just doesn't exist. Yep. Ooh, here we go. The Herod and Quirinius. Am I saying it right? Quirinius?
I don't know how to say. I say it. Quirinius.
Yeah. Landon has kind of studied this little problem at length. He was trying to explain to me what this is. So it's the Herod and Quirinius problem. Do you want to read this, Landon, and talk about this? I think there's 2 slides on it.
Yeah, there is an apparent discrepancy between the biblical accounts of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Matthew, which places it during the reign of King Herod the Great, and the Gospel of Luke, which mentions a census conducted by Quirinius, a Roman governor who only took office several years after Herod's death, creating a chronological inconsistency.
I think the next slide goes into the details. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, Herod in Matthew ruled from 37 BCE to 4 BCE. According to Matthew, the Wisemen visited the baby Jesus while Herod was still king, prompting him to order the massacre of infants in Bethlehem. Therefore, Jesus was born between 37 BCE and 4 BCE. Quirinius in Luke began rule in 6 AD. Luke's narrative mentions a census ordered by Quirinius, which historically occurred after Herod's death. Therefore, Jesus was born in or after 6 AD. So there's a 10-year gap between when Herod died and where Quirinius ordered a census. You can't solve they tried to say, oh, Quirinius was a governor prior to that.
There's 2 censuses.
They have to make these 2 stories work, and you can't make them work. Herod is dead long before Quirinius orders census,
which that didn't even happen. So I mean, that's what we're talking about. So many imaginary events trying to make them correspond.
And he actually would have had to have been born prior to his death, because remember, the Wisemen went and asked Herod where they could find him. The Wisemen didn't leave until the star appeared. The Wisemen have to travel from Persia and get there, and then it says they found the child By this time, he's a child, not a baby.
Right. So
If he
he's
ran
2
off to
years.
Egypt, they warned him, I guess, and then he ran off to Egypt. But he's already a child by the time they meet him. So this is months after the
Yeah.
star appeared. So again, problems. And how did they find him in Bethlehem if, in the one account, he went back to Nazareth after 32 days? The wise men couldn't possibly have gotten to Bethlehem in that time period. So they would have had to find him in Nazareth. But we're told that he fled and then went back to Nazareth. So causes
My
all
head
kinds
is
of
spinning.
problems.
My
Yeah.
head is spinning. I can't figure it out. I'm just going to stick with the narrative of my Cocker Spaniel in a laundry basket with a blanket on and me with a bath towel being Mary. That's as simple, or that's as complex as I want it to be. Oh, this is a good one. And you kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, the star problem. The story of the Star of Bethlehem appears only in the book of Matthew. The gospel tells us that a bright star appeared in the eastern sky when Jesus was born, famously seen by a group of wise men who followed it. And lo, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. The star was not seen by Herod's astronomers, whose job it is to carefully watch the cosmos. It is not recorded in other parts of the world by other cultures. I know you've talked about this a lot, Landon.
Yeah, this is, as John Lundwall tells us, this is a a society, or these are farmers, and
Right,
they
rooted in the
live by the
cosmos.
cosmos. They plant by the stars. Everything they do is by the stars. There is a prophecy that a star will come. They're looking for a star to come, and we read that it's this bright star that you can't miss, and yet Herod's astronomers go, oh, we haven't seen a star. What are you talking about? Well, what star? And then they're like, well, go find him and then let us know. So evidently they go out and they still can't find the star, but the wise men seem to know about the star.
It's
So
spiritual eyes. The wise men are seeing it through their spiritual eyes,
that
as if through a mountain.
and we get the same. Now people will say, well, the Book of Mormon, they saw this star. Yeah, how convenient is that that they saw the star? The people recorded in the Book of Mormon saw the star that is written by Joseph Smith, who knows about the star. Yet no other culture writes about this star at this time. That's hard to believe in societies that live and die by the stars, that nobody wrote what this star is at this time period, what it could be. And how do people in the wise men followed this star to find the baby Jesus?
Yeah, I think that's our next slide. How does that even work?
How do you do that?
I was going to say, though, that especially in the Chinese culture of that time, they were meticulously recording, astronomy, events in the sky, I'm trying to say, right? And nothing anywhere else except for this gospel and the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of interesting. Guilt by association, I think.
Oh, you want me to read that?
Yeah, go ahead. You can. I think there's 2 more slides about this star, talking about what it could have been and also the problematic nature of following it.
Scholars have been discussing potential causes since at least the 13th century. Perhaps it was a supernova, a meteor, a comet, a solar flare, or an alignment of planets. Or alternatively, maybe it never happened at all. All of these other supernova, meteor, comet would have been noticed by everyone.
Yep. And they're also problematic as far as following them. The most current theory is an alignment of planets, is what they're saying, because we've recently had those in our own cosmos. And so we sort of know what that looks like. So there are a lot of theories that it could be some kind of alignment of planets, but the closest thing happened, again, a problematic date, not when Jesus is supposed to have been born.
Yeah. And again, everyone knew the movements of the planets. They knew how they moved. They knew where they'd be. If that was going to be the sign, they would have known it was coming before it even came, because they knew the movements and when these things would happen. These cultures were not uneducated in that. Oops.
Yep, it's fine. We talk about following the star under the Magi problem. So I'll read that part and then you can read the star part after that. The Bible, this is the Magi problem. The Bible only mentions some men from the East and visitors from the East. The number of wise men is not specified, and traditions do vary. And of course, we all have our little nativity where we have the three wise men, standing there. The Bible does not name the wise men. The tradition of naming them Gaspar, Melchior, I guess I've never even pronounced these, and Balthazar is based on the three gifts that they are said to have brought. So 3 gifts, 3 wise men. That's where that comes from. The Bible says that the wise men came to Jerusalem during the reign of King Herod, again, 37 BC to 4 BCE to 4 BCE.
And this one always confused me because the Magi are, from a false religion. So God is telling the false religion, hey, go, there's this Jewish king that's been born. You need to go and give him presents. It makes absolutely no sense why someone from a religion that is not part of their religion would be coming and giving gifts to this king. I doubt they came when King Herod died and his sons became, or when King Herod had his sons, did the Magi come and bear gifts? I don't know, but this just seems awful fishy that all of this happened. Yeah. But we go back to the star problem.
Yeah.
Trying to follow a star to get anywhere, say Bethlehem, would lead to problems. Trying to do that would send them around in circles. Since the earth is not fixed, it rotates and is in orbit around the sun. Stars are never in the same place in the sky, so following one would take you all over the place. And we all know that, the only star that doesn't move in the sky is Polaris, which is the North Star, because it's directly over the axis of the earth where it spins. Everything else, if you follow it through the night, we see the star rise and then they set, just like the sun does. So it'd be just like trying to follow the sun to somebody's house. At noon, it's at a different location than it is at 10.
I have a great slide next. Go to the next one. You can keep talking about it. And then I have a picture from our friend Ron Jorgensen after this. So this is exactly what you're trying to say.
Yeah. If the wise men leave Jerusalem and walk toward the star Sirius, day and night, even when it's below the horizon, this is the path they follow over the surface. You see that they go from Jerusalem and Bethlehem and the Dead Sea, and they end up in Antarctica.
Yep.
If we allow a little theological confusion and assume the wise men can walk on water, they'll eventually wind up going in an endless circle, 30 kilometers in diameter around the South Pole.
There you go.
So
this is from Bart Ehrman's blog, and he found it somewhere else, but it was pretty entertaining. Yeah, this is an awesome picture from our friend Ron Jorgensen to show what Landon is saying. There's the night sky on the left, and he says, I repeatedly took 20-second exposures for an hour. Then I stacked all the images together into one image to show the light trails across the sky. Look at that. Beautiful photography, Ron. That's incredible.
And you can see the bright star there in the left-hand corner of the one. That might be a planet. I'm not sure. But then look at it in the picture, and you see it's moving. It's clearly moving. And if you were to try to follow that anywhere, you would never be able to follow it. It's moving just like the sun is. It would be over a different place. The only place you could follow it is if it was in, geosynchronous orbit above Jerusalem and was rotating at the same rate that the earth was, which stars do not do. Right. So in that case, it would have to be something else. But then you've got a problem if you're Mormon, because if it's in geosynchronous orbit over Israel, how do people in the Americas see it? Because it's day there, night here. It's staying over the top of it. You'd never see it. You wouldn't be able to see it. So this star has to be moving, and therefore you'd never be able to follow it.
Well, all things are possible with God. I think that's the answer to a lot of these. All things are possible. So we don't need to understand the mysteries. But it is interesting to picture them just like wandering around the South Pole, right? So
so more about the Wisemen. People in Antarctica would probably not do well.
Yeah, I don't think so either. More about the Wisemen. Most scholars believe that Jesus was approximately 2 years old when the Wisemen came. Several things point to this. 2 verses help in determining the answer. And they, the shepherds, came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe laying in the manger. That's Luke 2:16. Then Matthew 2:11 says, and when they, the wise men, have come into the house, they saw the young child, not babe, but young child, with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshiped him. In Luke, when Jesus was born and the shepherds came to see him, he is called the babe. In Matthew, when the wise men come to see him, he is called the young child. So I think most scholars agree that there's a time gap there between the visits.
And there's a reason that would make you think that too, and that is because Herod killed all the male children under 2 years of age. And remember, the wise men stopped and talked to Herod, and that's when Herod said, "Oh, we don't know who these are." And he said, "Oh, come back and tell us when you find the babe." And then the wise men never did.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if the baby had just been born, why kill everyone 2 and under? Why not just kill every baby that's under a year or under 6 months?
Great point. I've
But
never thought of that.
they killed everyone who's under 2, which indicates that the wise men had probably come sometime before he made this execution requirement, which we know didn't happen. But in the story, that's what makes you say it had to have been a period of time before Herod ordered that.
Yeah, I never thought about that angle. That's so, trying to make all these sort of fabricated narratives fit together. It's problematic. All right, let's move on. Oh, here we go. The virgin birth problem. And we did a whole episode on this, didn't we, Landon? It was one of our first episodes when we first started Mormonish, and then we re-put it out last year, I think. So why don't you talk about this one? I think I have 2 slides on this.
Okay, the virgin birth found in both Matthew and Luke is conspicuously absent from the rest of the New Testament. Neither Paul, who literally thought of Jesus as God incarnate, nor John, who presents Jesus as pre-existent with God in the beginning, say anything about a miraculous birth. This silence is striking given how central this doctrine would become to later theology.
Yeah.
You want me to keep going?
Yeah, you can talk about the virgin birth. I think I might have 3 slides on it.
Matthew 1:23 misrepresents the whole Isaiah 7:14 verse, changing the young woman into a virgin and changing present tense has conceived is giving birth to future tense. So, the Isaiah where it says, "And they shall give you a son, and his name shall be Emmanuel," and all of that. In Isaiah, that was happening in Isaiah's time, and then they changed it to a future time to make it work. It also misreads the name Emmanuel, which in the Hebrew is a whole sentence properly rendered as a statement of faith in God, saying that God is with us. The Hebrew word used for the young mother in Isaiah 7:14 is Alma, young woman. This is the feminine form of the Hebrew word Elam, young man. That pair of words does not mean that all young women and all young men are virgins. Yet some widely used English translations of Isaiah 7:14 and Matthew 1:23, which uses Parthenos, turn young woman into virgin. So in the original, this child was born to a young woman, not to a virgin. But we're in Hellenistic, 0 CE here, where virgins, it was important. You had the Vestal virgins in Rome, and virginity represented purity, and God's lay with women, and they gave birth to virgins. So that makes it a much more magical story. But the Isaiah reference never was intended to refer to Jesus. It was always referenced someone of Isaiah's time. So that's where they get this story. And when you think about this, the whole story becomes problematic. A young woman goes and tells her husband that, or her fiance, that she's pregnant, and angels have to come and tell her that tell him that no, it's okay, it's really from God. And so he goes ahead and marries her and raises the child of his own. The problem I have with this whole scenario is if all of this happened and Mary knew that this child was the Son of God, we remember when Jesus is having his when he's starting his ministry, and everyone thought he was crazy, and they had his family come, and his family thought he was crazy, his brothers and his sisters. Well, Mary should be rich at this time, because the wise men brought her all this gold and mercury, not mercury.
Mercury. That'd be a different problem.
That'd be a different problem, yeah. But myrrh and frankincense and gold, she had all of this. She'd have been a wealthy woman, and she would have told all her brothers and sisters, "Oh, you're only you're only wealthy because your brother is a king, and the wise men
Right.
brought and gave us these gifts, and he's going to be a future Messiah. Instead, they all seem to agree that he's crazy.
Right.
Like his family has never heard of the fact that he's born of a virgin birth and that God is putting him out for a big future, uh,
Right.
messiahship.
His destiny.
Yeah, his
Exactly.
destiny. They all would know this. His brothers and sisters would know this
No.
story backwards and forwards. James never tells this story.
No.
James is his brother.
Well, and
How
he has a twin
and
brother,
he may
right?
possibly have a twin brother,
Yeah,
Thomas. Yes.
exactly. That's another rabbit hole that Jesus probably most likely had a twin brother. That how does that work?
Yeah,
So
so a whole problem of things come up when you start thinking about this that can't be answered, and apologists will go on, they'll dive in, they'll try to solve one. The problem is you solve one, you create a problem for the other.
exactly.
You can't resolve that the census and Herod when they're 10 years apart,
Hmm.
and so you solve the census, but then you don't solve Herod. You don't solve the Wisemen. You don't. Every one of these, you have to solve a problem, which causes a problem for the other one. So big problems with the narrative.
It's true, but I will say in my research, there are apologetics for every single one of
Yeah.
these issues and scenarios. It's all very well documented out there. So I thought this was interesting about the virgin birth. It says Matthew seems to understand the importance of the virgin birth differently from Luke. So, different motivations for writing about the virgin birth. For Matthew, the virgin birth principally shows that Jesus's birth was a fulfillment of the divine plan as revealed by the fact that up and down the line it fulfilled prophecy. So, he wrote it from a point of view of this is in fulfillment of a prophecy of this Messiah. Luke has a different take. He never gives the prophecy fulfillment formula you find so often in Matthew. This happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, yada, 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 right? In his case, Luke, the virgin birth was a completely different function. Jesus is born of a virgin because it is the Spirit of God that has made Mary pregnant, not a human being. So, that in a very literal sense, Jesus is the Son of God. So, that was Luke's motivation. He had to be an actual, literal Son of God.
Yeah. So two different reasons for it
Two
being
different
important.
motivations. Yeah. You can read this one.
It is not clear whether Matthew agreed with Luke that the virgin birth literally made Jesus the Son of God, or if Luke agreed with Matthew that the virgin birth transpired in order to fulfill Scripture. This is not exactly a contradiction between the two accounts, but it is a very big difference. What mattered to Matthew was the fulfillment of Scripture. What mattered to Luke was the divine ancestry of Jesus. Later readers would simply combine the two accounts.
And that's it. Because if we're asked, we're going to say it fulfilled the scriptures and he was the Son of God, right? That's
Yep.
what we know the purpose of Jesus's birth. So interesting how that happens. All right. Now, simplistically, the stable problem, right? The Greek word, let's see, kataluma means lodging place. And it's usually translated upper room, lodging place, or guest room, not inn. It can refer to a room in a house where out of town guests could spend the night or even just a dining room. For example, in Mark 14:14, Jesus celebrated Passover with his disciples in an upper room. They use the same word here. This is why in the 2010 NIV version of the Bible, it translates Luke 2:7 like this. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available to them. In all reality, Jesus was most likely born in a house. Many assume that Jesus was born in some sort of stable where the animals were kept. However, in the time of Jesus, humble folks lived with their animals. So the idea is that they actually were in some kind of a guest room and, Mary and Joseph were there and then there was a manger and that's where they put Jesus. So the narrative that it was outside, in the inn, they were in the lowest of low places. And of course, we all have nativity scenes that show that, right? The stable. It was most likely not that. A lot of poetic license there.
Yeah, I actually was in Egypt and did a hot air balloon ride. And as we went over the houses, you could look down and you could see into their houses that they had a lot of open court areas and stuff like that. So you could see into the houses and you could see the animals were living in the houses with them. So even today, that's a thing. So, he was with the animals, but so was everybody else. They
Yep. I
lived
get
with the
that. A
animals.
lot of people sleep with their dogs
Yeah,
and their
yeah.
cats. Oh, that's funny. Okay. The date, the December 25th problem. Do you want to read this, Landon?
Jesus' birth is not on December 25th, and the exact date of his birth is unknown. The Bible doesn't specify the day or season of Jesus' birth, and most scholars agree he wasn't born on December 25th or even in the year AD.
Or now called CE.
CE,
Yep.
yeah.
Exactly. So, and I think a lot of us are familiar with that. However, interestingly, if you go to the next slide, Mormons know. We know when he was born, or we knew. It says in his 1915 book, Jesus the Christ, Talmage proposed this date based on the literal interpretation of Doctrine and Covenants 20, verse 1. This verse states that the LDS Church was organized on April 6, 1830, 1,830 years after the birth of Jesus. Therefore, Jesus's birthday is April 6th of, I guess, 0001, right? Or 000. I mean, whatever it would be. So, and this, my family went with this. We would celebrate Jesus's birthday on April 6th. And my parents made sure that we knew that Christmas was not the birthday, but we had special knowledge and we knew when it was. It was April 6th. Now, they have kind of walked that back. Have you noticed that? They don't really say
They
that anymore.
absolutely say we never said that, even though
Yeah.
I was taught
Yep.
that same thing. So
Yep. If you were to ask a younger person, somebody in their 20s right now who went through seminary, they'd go, "What are you talking about?" But it was an absolute fact for me growing up and for everybody else. We had that special knowledge. We knew when Jesus was really born.
the April 6th was a special day in history.
That's right. So how did we end up with December 25th? Do you want to read this, Landon?
The Romans celebrated the winter solstice around December 25th with a festival called Saturnalia, and later the birth of the sun god Sol Invictus, making it a convenient date for early Christians to adopt for Jesus' birth. This was likely to ease the conversion of pagans to Christianity by aligning their existing celebrations with the birth of Jesus. And it's fun to note that one of the big things that they did during Saturnalia was they had like races where they all ran naked through the streets.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
I listed some of the
did you
things
list
they
that?
did.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like we, if we're not going to so much celebrate, the Christian holiday, maybe we should adopt some of these practices. I don't know. So I don't think I listed the naked running here. Why don't you tell us more about that?
I just some of the Roman books I've read that's what they would do is they'd have like races and yeah, they'd run naked through the street.
You start that tradition, Landon. You do that right now.
I think
You
I
go
will.
outside
And
of
then
your
I'll
house.
start the tradition of bailing Dad out of jail on
Yeah.
Christmas Day.
Perfect. Okay, so some of the things that they really did, that's so funny. They had decorations. Homes were decorated with wreaths and evergreen plants and candles. Clothing. People wore colorful clothing instead of their traditional togas. Slaves wore special cone-shaped hats called palei, which, could that be an elf? Could that be, a lot of the Christmas symbolism or Santa is a cone-shaped hat. Food and drink. Romans ate lots of food and drank lots of wine. There you go. We can probably all get behind that.
Running through the streets, yeah.
And while they were running through the streets, gifts. People gave each other gifts, usually small figurines made of wax or terracotta called sigillaria, or candles called cereri. Different activities. People played games, they sang, they shared tales, and they went around the streets singing songs. This sounds amazing. It was a carnival atmosphere. Roles were switched, and the usual rules for society turned upside down. Masters invited their slaves to the feast and served them food. The election of the king of Saturnalia. The king of Saturnalia gave orders to people, which were followed and presided over the merrymaking.
I think that's where the running naked, the king would all of a sudden, "Oh, you're the king, you got to make merry," and then he'd make up these things. And
it's kind of like a feast of Bacchus, I think. Just, merrymaking and all kinds of things. It also says sacrifice. A sacrifice was made at the temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum. So this is what they had been doing pre-Christianity. And then the Christians kind of, appropriated this holiday and made it into, I think, their own. Some of these traditions, gifts and clothing and decorations, but the naked running, I think they left that in the dust.
I did check this out, and the first whenever
Yeah,
you
go to
say
the next slide. Yeah, with
okay,
the dates. Yeah,
did you
remember
add
you
that
gave me
in?
that
Okay, there you
information. Yeah,
go.
here we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, so Jesus was the first recorded celebration of Christmas was in 336 AD. So this is the first time
Yep,
anyone actually celebrates it in Rome, but the holiday's origins are more complex.
of course.
So 336 AD is the first time we hear about Christmas. Now, if all of these things happen, these shepherds came
Hmm.
to see Jesus, wise men from the east came to see Jesus, this star appeared in the heaven to see Jesus. Don't you think that's something people might celebrate or make a
Yep.
celebration
Or
or a
record
festival
in some
around
way.
or
Yep,
report
yep.
that this important event happened? Yet nobody knows anything about this until they decide to celebrate it in 336 AD.
Yep. And it
Um,
says early Christians did not celebrate for the first 300 years of Christianity. Exactly what Landon just said. Birthdays were not emphasized. The day of a saint's death was considered more important than their birth. And I went out and found the actual first mention of celebrating Christmas on the next slide. This is kind of interesting. It says in an old list of Roman bishops compiled in CE
AD.
354. So they found this list was put together. These words appear for CE 336, like you said. 25 December, Natus Christus in Bethlehem, Judea, means December 25th, Christ born in Bethlehem, Judea. So that's it. It was just listed, a little mention in this list from a bishop. But again, 3 centuries after all those incredible events that everybody should have been aware of.
Yeah, to put that in perspective, we would need another 150 years to go by from when our nation was founded to reach the time where they said, "Oh, Christ was born on 25th of December."
Yeah, that's true. And imagine, think of events that we celebrate because we know they happened, like signing of the Declaration of Independence,
Yeah.
right? Imagine if no one talked about that until even 150 years later from now, right? It's just,
Yeah. All of a sudden, we're going to celebrate 4th of July
you're like,
because
what is 4th of July?
that's when they signed a piece of paper that we don't have and that
That
nobody
we've
knows
never
anything
talked about.
about.
That we,
Yeah.
Mormonism is full of things like that, right? Where it's kind of like backdated. I didn't mention that, somebody gave me the priesthood, or didn't I
Yeah.
mention, right? I forgot to say the first vision. There's a whole bunch of backdating going on, though. So, regardless of all of these things that we just discussed, the nativity, the Christmas story is still alive and well and everywhere. This is a movie that's out right now. There's sort of a rise of faith-based movies, I think, lately. Angel Studio puts a lot of stuff out, but this is called The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. It's based on a beloved children's book. It was one of my favorites. Did you ever read this book, Landon? You
I did
probably
not.
didn't.
No.
Yeah, it's about a crazy family of 6 kids, and they decide they want to be part of a nativity scene that a church is putting on. They don't know anything about religion or church, and they just go in there and they end up, of course, really teaching everybody what Christmas is all about. This movie's doing incredibly well in the box office right now. I would probably recommend it, especially for kids. But again, it's the story, the beloved story that we know, despite all these things that we talked about for the last whatever hour and a half. This nativity story is still alive and well and beloved. If you go to the next slide, we can talk about nativities, right? I had so many nativities growing up and in my home, and I haven't gotten rid of any of them. For me, it's kind of a cultural thing. I'm okay displaying something that is a cultural story. I think of it as a story. And at this point, I'm okay with it. I know I've talked to other people who have kind of deconstructed and also deconstructed Christianity a little more, and they don't want anything to do with this. So I don't know. It's up to individuals, I think. How do you feel about nativities or displaying nativities in your house?
We went to Temple Square and we saw where
Mm-hmm.
they had all these nativity sets from all these different cultures, and they
Yeah,
all
around the
had
world.
different cultural features and different. So it really appears as if, most cultures just celebrate it however they
Mm-hmm.
have seen it in the past. So I mean, it's a myth story, and they're cute. I've got mine set up. I just look at it a little bit differently, as this
Yeah.
is the story that is told to make this holiday real. But I will say you mentioned the movie. If you have not seen Violent Night,
Oh my
that is the
gosh.
best Christmas movie ever. Highly encourage watching
With
Violent Night.
badass Santa covered with tattoos. That's right. Let's go to the next slide. I thought it was interesting before we started this episode, Landon and I were talking. He spends a lot of time in Japan and other countries like that. And why don't you talk a little bit about how they celebrate Christmas like crazy, but it seems to be completely devoid of what we've talked about tonight, the nativity story, yet they still celebrate this holiday. It's kind of morphed into something else.
Yeah, I was there right after Halloween. I was there on Halloween
In
and
Japan.
in Japan, and the next day when I went to get some good Japanese food at the KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, I sat down and I was going, what is that? And they were playing Christmas carols on November 1st, U.S. Christmas carols. And I thought, oh, well, I'm at the KFC. That's kind of an American restaurant. And
Right,
then
right.
I walked back to my hotel and I noticed every hotel that I passed had a giant Christmas tree in their lobby on November 1st. And I have been in Okinawa and different places on around Christmas, and they have Santa and all the elves and different things in their setups too. So uh, people do celebrate Christmas without Christ. These are not Christian countries, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
There are Christians in Japan, but to them it's a big shopping holiday and a big festivity. Probably a lot more like Saturnalius
Right.
than
More like
how we
goodwill and
celebrate
friends
for
and
Christmas.
neighbors
Yeah.
and all that kind of thing. So,
Yep. So it's definitely celebrated different ways among different cultures.
yeah, I
And
think so too. And I think growing up in Mormonism, I think there's always a push, and some families took it to the extreme of not having any of that commercial, part of Christmas, like really just focusing on the reason for the season, really just focusing on the nativity and not the shopping, not the presents. I don't know. I think probably everybody knows a family that did that to death, right? You always just kind of looked at the kids and went, "Oh, that's kind of sad that you're just focusing on this part of it." But
well, we
people
we
pick and
have a
choose.
episode coming up with
Mm.
Kobe Reddish and his
Yep,
wife,
yep,
Cami,
yep.
where we talk very much about this. Can you, how do you handle Santa? How do you
Hmm.
handle maybe not uh, you don't believe in Jesus anymore?
Hmm.
You've become an atheist. How do you still celebrate Christmas and have make it fun and make it magical? And there are ways to do it, and I'm not sure if that's going to air before this or after
I
this.
think it'll be right after it. Yeah.
So
So I think this will be Tuesday. That'll be Friday, I think. So,
yeah, so just ideas to think about and to take away. Really a holiday is what you make the holiday, and you can
mhm.
make it about, like I say, I always say I'm a Christian atheist. I believe
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
teachings of Christ, in
Yep.
that how you treat other people and being kind and being charitable and those items. And you can do all of that without necessarily having to believe in the story. Uh, doesn't matter that Jesus was born 2,000 years ago or not. You can still be kind. You can
Hmm.
still be charitable. You can still pick something off a tree and buy something for a child,
Hmm.
uh, whether you believe that story or not. So that's the way I see Christmas.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is the reason for the season. I think just giving and love and friendship. I do have to say, being raised in the church, Christmas, our church, our ward did it very well. And I'm talking way back in the 70s. And I remember, I'll just share this quick memory because it's very real to me still. But my family used to sit on the very back row of church because my mom had health problems. And so she sometimes had to walk out. So we always sat on the very back row. And it was right next to the walkway of the cultural hall and the curtains, that you would
Yeah,
close
the
and then you'd have the
sliding
chapel.
curtain.
And exactly the sliding curtains. Yeah, this is the 70s. You guys can probably smell the building as I'm describing it. But our stake in that building would always have a full, like a Christmas tree to the ceiling. Like as a kid, it must have been 20 feet tall. I'm not kidding, because it did reach up to the ceiling of that cultural hallway. And because we sat in the back row, I sat right next to the tree. Like its branches were right. I could smell it. I can still smell it to this day. And it was decorated. And, I'd sit there and the talks, of course, would all be about the scriptures and Jesus and Christmas. But I would just sit there inhaling that Christmas tree. And it was so Christmassy as a little kid. It was so magical to be able to sit almost inside of, in the branches of this incredible tree. And I can still smell it and feel that, that Christmassy feeling. So I have to say, there were good parts of being raised in Mormonism, and the holiday season always seemed to be wonderful. I remember getting a little plastic manger scene from primary when I was very little, and that was a very big deal to me. So I do have those memories. And now here I am deconstructed on the other side of it. And I'm not letting those memories go. I remember what they were and what it meant. And I just have kind of morphed them like you have, Landon, just to feel good about people and humanity and service and kindness and giving and all of that. So I don't find Christmas. I know some people find Christmas very problematic and triggering. I don't, at least at this point, I don't. And I try to make it fun for others around me, and I try to appreciate what it is. So, maybe that's the message, it is what it is for wherever you happen to be at right now, right?
It is what you make it.
It is what you make it. So let's go to our final slide. And we just want to say, wishing you, all of you, our viewers and our listeners, the merriest of Christmases from Mormonish Podcast, because we love you guys. You're awesome. And it's been another really fun year. We started, I think our anniversary is like in the middle of December. I, of course, had shingles, right? So I wasn't going to do an anniversary episode, but I think since we're feeling all warm and fuzzy right now, we can just say thank you for 2 years of Mormonish. It's been absolutely amazing, hasn't it?
Yeah, it went by faster than my mission. So
it is almost like a mission, isn't it? Landon, would you like to give us a homecoming talk right now from Mormonish? Oh, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for sticking with this episode. Please comment and let us know. Did you know very much about the Christmas story and some of the more problematic parts of it? And what do you think about this? Or are you more aware of some of the apologetics? And how does that fit into your view of the Christmas story? And also let us know how you guys feel about Christmas and what you do to celebrate, what you've changed, what you've kept, and new traditions and things like that. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to help financially support Mormonish Podcast, we always have links in the show notes. We are a nonprofit, and we keep mentioning, for those of you that have just said, I'm not going to tithing declaration, but you're looking for a place to make a donation, you can always do it here. We appreciate you guys so much here at Mormonish. We also have links in the show notes to our merch store if you want to grab some Mormonish mug or hat or something. And thank you, Landon, for adding all of your knowledge to this podcast. Landon is kind of a biblical scholar. He doesn't talk about it very much, but he knows his stuff.
I like to research the Bible. I would not consider myself a scholar, and I'm sure those who are scholars will correct any mistakes I've made.
Which are probably a lot. This whole podcast I'll rip to shreds, but I don't think so. No, we really did a lot of research. So anyway, thank you for co-hosting. And again, happy holidays. We're getting close, everybody. So we'll see you next time on Mormonish. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.